Well, it's interesting that I had a very atheistic background. I had absolutely no exposure to religion in my childhood, actually. We had classes of religion, but for me this was a time of leisure. And then from this kind of background, I went to the medical school. That certainly doesn't cultivate mystical awareness. And in addition, this was at a time when we were controlled by the Soviet Union. We had a Marxist regime. So really the purest materialistic education you can get. So I am a somewhat exceptional case in that I was brought to spirituality and mysticism through laboratory and clinical work. And it was basically my first psychedelic experience when I volunteered for an LSD session that just opened this whole area completely and unexpectedly.
Stan Grof was born in Czechoslovakia in 1931, where he grew up with his parents and younger brother, Paul. He was first exposed to LSD as a medical student at Charles University in Prague, when his professor, brain researcher George Rubicek, became interested in studying its effects on brainwaves. At that time, Grof was at a crossroads and unclear of his professional direction.
And I was in the middle of this crisis where I started questioning whether it was a good choice to become a psychiatrist. And my initial plan was to actually work in animated movies. I like to paint and draw. And when I was finishing what we call gymnasium in Europe, it's the equivalent of high school, I had an interview with a leading artist in the animated movie industry, and I was supposed to start working in the Barrandov film studios in Prague. And just at that time, a friend of mine gave me introductory lectures, psychoanalysis, Freud, and I read it overnight and decided in a very short time that I will move from animated movies to psychoanalysis. This is where it was at for me. So at the time when LSD came, I was really questioning the choice whether I really should have studied medical school and psychiatry.
During that LSD session in 1956, Grof had an experience that profoundly altered his worldview and the course of his life.
I took the LSD, and the first part was a combination of beautiful, beautiful aesthetic, kind of fractal, I would call it fractals today, images. At that time I talk about arabesques, or it was like kaleidoscopic images, or like stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals and so on. And then it also opened into my individual history. It was very much sort of like psychoanalysis, only much more profound. I sort of seeing connections that I didn't discover in my self-exploration before.
Then the research assistant brought him to a dark room. He laid down, and she put a strobe light over his head.
And my consciousness was just completely catapulted out of my body, and I lost the connection with the place of the experiment, with the research assistant, with the clinic, with Prague, and then with the planet. And then I had the feeling that I had absolutely no boundaries. I sort of, became all there was. And then later in that experiment, I was actually in the physical universe, where I actually became somehow the physical universe, and there were sort of things happening for which at the time I didn't have a name. But later I read about the Big Bang and the black holes and the white holes and the wormholes and so on.
While Grof was inside this cosmic display, the research assistant continued following protocol, adjusting the strobe from 2 Hertz up to 60. She left it for a while in the alpha and delta range and then turned it off.
And then my consciousness started sort of shrinking. And I reconnected with the planet, and then finally found my body. And for quite a while I couldn't actually get my consciousness together. with my body. And it became absolutely clear to me that what they taught me in the university about consciousness being the product of matter, of the neurophysiological processes in the brain, was just not true, that consciousness was something much bigger, and that at least was an equal partner of matter, but possibly supraordinated to matter. I could, at that point, imagine that consciousness could create reality, but I couldn't imagine that matter would create consciousness. And then finally I managed to get the two together, consciousness and my body, and obviously I was very impressed. And I realized I was already stuck with psychiatry, and I felt, the most interesting thing you can do when you're a psychiatrist is to study these states. So really the last, it's now more than 50 years, this was 56, I have really done very little professionally that would not be related in one way or another to these non-ordinary state, or the specific subgroup which I call holotropic.
Grof graduated in 1960 and began his clinical work. He was assigned to Prague's Psychiatric Research Institute, which had just launched a psychedelic research center. Among his colleagues was Miloš Vojdechovský, and in the early 60s they co-published nearly 24 papers on their pioneering clinical research, including a 3-part study on LSD's clinical history, biochemistry, and pharmacology.
So the study of these states became kind of my, profession, vocation, passion, my sort of lifetime commitment.
As he moved up the ranks, Grof's work at the Psychiatric Institute increasingly involved combining LSD with traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, in which he'd earned a PhD in 1965 from the Czech Academy of Sciences. While Grof had found his own psychoanalysis fascinating, considering the time and money invested, he questioned the results.
My own analysis lasted 7 years, and I loved every minute of it, playing with my dreams and finding there was a deep meaning in every slip of my tongue. But if you ask me, did it change you? I would say, well, I changed during those 7 years, but there was no convincing relationship for me between the free associating that I did on the couch and the interpretations and any kind of changes that happened in my life. Whereas when I had my first LSD session, I was one kind of person in the morning and a whole other person in the evening, and there was no question that what happened was a result of that experience.
Grof was convinced that, used responsibly, psychedelics would do for psychiatry what the microscope had done for biology and the telescope for astronomy. But then, the cultural and political thaw in communist Czechoslovakia, known as Prague Spring, came to an end. By the time the Russians rolled into Prague in August 1968, Grof had left for the US, first as a research fellow to Johns Hopkins University and the research unit of the Spring Grove State Hospital in Baltimore, and then chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. There, he headed the last surviving official research project of psychedelic therapy in the United States.
When I came to the United States, I used to do, besides the work in Maryland, I used to do workshops at Esalen. And my early workshops, Paul came to me, Paul, who was a kind of chronicler at Esalen, who recorded all the seminars and had pretty much a good idea what was happening in the field. He recorded my seminar, and then he said, what you're talking about is very much like what Abe Maslow is talking about, and you guys should sort of get together and exchange information. And I really didn't know about Maslow because when I was in Czechoslovakia, we had very little contact with the West. I mean, it was even dangerous to have too much of an exchange. We couldn't get hard currency, we couldn't buy books. We were pretty much limited to reprints that we could ask for, and got reprints of Western authors and so on. So I didn't know Maslow. But at the time, I had a manuscript which was very, very thick, had never been published, or has never been published, but became kind of 5 other books. And I sent it to Maslow, and I got very enthusiastic invitation from him to come see him in Boston, where he was recovering at the time after a heart attack. So I got an invitation from him and flew to Boston to see him. And I rang the bell. His wife Bertha came to answer the door, and I had the feeling that I was not really welcome, that she was kind of blocking the door with her body, And I didn't know, we had never met before, so I didn't know what was happening. And then Abe and I had, many wonderful hours of exchange. And then when we were having dinner, she finally told me that when he received this manuscript and was reading it and saw this tremendous similarity to his own findings, the peak experiences, spontaneous peak experiences that people had, that he was getting so excited that she was afraid that when we get together, it's going to be so emotional that he could have another heart attack. So that was the reason.
No, I think Stan's going to go down in history as one of the great figures in psychiatry of the second half of the 20th century as well as the beginning of the 21st century. He really, in many respects, he established that this field, the validity of this field, and really built a foundation, not only in regards to psychedelic research, but another aspect of Stan's contribution, which I don't think is adequately appreciated, is his role in the genesis of the transpersonal psychology movement, particularly his work with psychedelics.
So, and Abe invited me then to Palo Alto. In the meantime, he got a scholarship from the McLaughlin Foundation. They gave him a house, and all he had to do was to think and write. And so he invited me then to participate in several of the meetings involving Tony Sutich himself, Sonia Margulies, Miles Wick, Jim Fadiman. In one of these meetings, also Viktor Frankl. And so we were sort of together talking about transpersonal psychology and formulating, the basic principles of it.
During these discussions, Maslow and Sutich accepted Grof's suggestion and named the new discipline transpersonal psychology. Soon after, they launched the Association of Transpersonal Psychology and the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology.
So this was obviously very, very important, the interaction with particularly Tony and Abe, that led to transpersonal psychology. And then we finally ended up with psychology that we were very pleased with. We felt that this was very culturally sensitive. It didn't make schizophrenics out of the founders of great religions and shamans and so on. And also incorporated the challenging observations from consciousness research, psychedelic research and meditation, and other areas. But we were facing this major problem that this new psychology was really fundamentally incompatible with what we knew as science, accepted hard science, and was very vulnerable to such accusations as being flaky, irrational, unprofessional, and so on. And for a while, we just didn't know what to do with this. And then I was invited to a party in Francis Vaughan's house in Tiburon, which was basically about the Tao of physics. It was a party for Fritjof Capra. And we instantly connected there. And I realized that the problem that we were facing is that we were sort of trying to reconcile transpersonal psychology with 17th century thinking, in basically coming from physics, and that physicists themselves, as Fritjof showed, transcended every single aspect of the Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm at the beginning of the 20th century, and that the other disciplines like biology, medicine, and certainly psychology, psychiatry were still stuck in that old sort of Cartesian-Newtonian thinking. And that what we have to do is to connect it with this kind of a new paradigm that was coming, that was emerging.
In 1973, Grof was asked to join the Esalen Institute as a scholar in residence. He relocated to their property in Big Sur, California, to write, lecture, and give seminars on his work. It was at one of those seminars that he fell in love with a woman who was to become his wife.
I met Stan through the great mythologist Joseph Campbell, and I had begun to have non-ordinary experiences spontaneously with the birth of my first child. In 1975, on the heels of a divorce, these experiences accelerated, and I decided to go see Joseph Campbell.
Christina had studied with him, and they remained friends after college.
He said, well, I don't get into experiences, I just study them. But he said, I know somebody who knows about these things. His name is Stan Grof. He lives at Esalen Institute in California. You ought to go see him. And I met Stan, and he and Jack Kornfield were going to be doing a 6-week seminar on Buddhism and Western psychology, and they offered me a scholarship to the program. So that was the perfect thing to do, to go and figure out my life and what I was going to do next. And it was in the course of those 6 weeks that the two of us fell in love.
Christina and Stan were married in a small ceremony in Los Gatos on January the 4th, 1978. Zen master Kobun Chino presided as Stan and Christina each took fire from his candle, which represented the divine source, and then connected the two fires together. Michael and Elsie Murphy, Anjali Zarian, and Sonia Margulis were among the witnesses.
The thing that really drew me to Stan, beside the personal attraction, was his work and the perspective that he had on non-ordinary states. Although I'd never had psychedelics, a lot of the experiences I was having fit into the writing he'd done in his first book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And I just felt as though I needed to know more. And I began to feel a little bit more sane as I was exposed to this groundbreaking work.
Well, Stan's work has been just, really has really established the foundation for a field. The breadth of it is quite extraordinary. His actual clinical work with patient populations, his mapping out really the cartography of inner states, and his examinations of metaphysics and tying them into other world countries at various points in time have just been amazing. But for me, most importantly, was his work, first and foremost, with psychedelics. He actually was, during the period that psychedelics were permitted to be researched in the 50s and 60s into the very early 70s, the most prolific researcher in the field. He treated thousands of patients, all above board, legal, sanctioned, part of rigorous study.
It was a very exciting time in the whole consciousness movement, and especially at Esalen. The co-founder of Esalen, Dick Price, was a risk taker, and he would invite or support our inviting people who were controversial, who were new on the scene, who were old and well-known teachers.
Stan and Christina created month-long workshops where they would choose a topic or area to explore and invite faculty to teach and do experiential work with the groups. Over the years, they invited many different teachers, including Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Fritjof Capra, who wrote The Tao of Physics, Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist from England, Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Benedictine monk who teaches about gratitude, Houston Smith, scholar and author of The Religions of Man. Also invited were Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield and Tibetan lamas, including Chogyam Trungpa and Sogyo Rinpoche.
The chemistry of bringing all those people together and going into the lodge, the main lodge, during lunch or dinner hour and seeing those stars in the consciousness movement sitting together with the group members from our groups and other people in the community, just hanging out and talking, and there were ideas zipping back and forth, all done within this extraordinarily beautiful setting.
During this time, as psychedelic research was falling out of favor, Christina and Stan made an important discovery.
We continued doing these month-long groups at Esalen, as well as 5-day groups and weekends. And we stumbled on something we now call holotropic breathwork, which has been our work for many years.
Holotropic breathwork is an experiential approach to self-exploration. The word holotropic means literally moving toward wholeness. With eyes closed and lying on a mat, participants use their own fast breathing and the evocative music in the room to enter a non-ordinary state of consciousness.
What began to happen is that we saw, and many of the participants in these workshops would see, that many of these experiences that people were having fit into the model of the psyche that came out of psychedelic work, and that they were very, very similar territories and similar experiences. In fact, we've had people say, this was more powerful than my psychedelic experience.
Well, I think one of the most interesting, most exciting observations from the work with holotropic states, with the whole spectrum of whether it's psychedelics or the breath work or working with people in spiritual emergencies and so on, is the discovery of what we now refer to as the inner healer. You know, we have the idea in traditional psychotherapy is that we should somehow try to understand with our intellect how the psyche functions, why the symptoms emerge, what they mean, and then from our intellectual understanding we come with a technique. Now the holotropic strategy is very different. It's a situation where you use some kind of method that induces the holotropic state, whether it's breathing or shamanic drumming or psychedelic